should be based on the best available evidence. So they shouldn't be only democratically legitimized, by government, that's sort of democratically legitimized, but also scientifically, so based on the best available evidence. Well, once policymakers do that, implement the policy, it doesn't seem to be working. So that's another big problem. So what we learn from science and try to put it into practice, very often, many case studies that show, well, here's the best, the policy that is best supported by the available evidence, but it's not working. And then there's a sort of political or ideological bias crisis that many commentators have observed or believe that many areas of science exhibit an ideological bias. A stupid example is gender studies. You won't find many conservative researchers in gender studies. But many, many areas of science, at least according to some commentators, are characterized by a bias such as that. That not just that science is politicized, but also that it's politicized from one particular perspective. That leads to problems. And then there are some cases, and I think they're relatively rare. I gave this talk before. Sometimes, people say, well, actually, fraud is much more prominent than you think. So I'm a bit optimistic that that fraud is actually rare, but there are these cases of fraud, right? Where people just fabricate the data and then make a career out of false data. So these examples will exist. But all of these crises essentially threaten the objectivity of the sciences. And now, when I talk about science, I really mean social sciences, psychology, behavioral sciences, those kinds of sciences. But just to be short, I will talk about science in general. And so, in various ways, it threatens the objectivity of science. And I just want to give a few examples of three ideas. So objectivity is not one thing. It's different related ideals scientists try to achieve. One is faithfulness to facts. So when we have a scientific hypothesis, we want it to be true, right? We want it to represent the facts. Well, if we have a replicability crisis, we don't know what the facts are, because there could be one thing, there could be another thing, that threatens the idea of what science produces is faithful to the facts. Freedom from personal idiosyncrasies is another ideal of objectivity. Science should be the same no matter what my personal beliefs are. Whether I'm black or white or left-wing or right-wing or tall or short or whatever, none of these things should influence the scientific results I'm endorsing. But of course, if there's political bias, then these kinds of personal factors do affect scientific output. So that threatens that idea. And another ideal is value freedom, and again, political ideological bias threatens the value freedom idea. And the problem is, if science isn't or isn't perceived to be objective, people lose trust in science. And that's a big problem, because of course we would like science, and in particular the social and behavioral sciences, to play the beneficial role in society. That policies really are supported by the best evidence, or that, that somehow society can use science in order to improve their well-being, their lives, their freedom, and so on and so forth, right? We want science to play a positive role in society. It can't play it if people do not trust science. So that's the big problem. And so what can be done? And adversarial collaboration is one proposal to fix this problem. And so it's offered as one response to this multi-crisis, but only one response. There are other responses as well. Open science is another example, right? So if we do more data sharing, now you see that, and really, so my background is in economics, and in the 1990s I studied economics. When I studied economics, it looked really different from what it looks like now. Nobody published their data along with the papers. You got the result, but not the data. Today in economics, it's absolutely standard that people share their data so that other people can actually test and can try to replicate, and so on and so forth. That is called open science, more data sharing and kinds of practices. AdCol comes on top, so to speak. It's meant to be one more quiver in the arsenal, essentially. Right? Sorry, arrow in the quiver of attempts to solve this crisis. The origins, the term comes from Daniel Kahneman, a Nobel Prize-winning psychologist, actually, won the Nobel Prize in economics. He wrote an article on various kinds of collaborations in psychology and coined the term adversarial collaboration. The practice is a little bit older, from the late 1980s, where essentially there was a debate in psychology on whether making workers participate in goal setting. So, for example, you can ask in a company all the workers, how much more revenue do we want to generate next year? Is 15% okay? And then, you make a decision somehow according to the workers, and that helps with motivation. And there was a strand in the literature that believed that hypothesis, there was another strand that opposed that hypothesis, and so they got together and tried to resolve that issue in a collaboration to tackle this particular question. And that was the first instance, so to speak, of this new practice. Corey Clark and Philip Tetlock, in a very recent paper, have described the practice as follows. So they are running a huge adversarial collaboration project at the University of Pennsylvania, which is really ongoing. And I'll give a few examples later, but this is how they characterize the practice. So essentially what you do is, so it's always about resolving a scientific controversy. So there's a hypothesis, participating in goal setting helps motivation, that's a hypothesis. And it has to be disputed, so some people agree, some people disagree. The first step is to articulate as best as you can the opponent's views. So they call that the Steelman version, is meant to contrast with the strawman version, right? So you're not attacking the weakest possible opponent, but rather the strongest possible opponent you can think of. So first you describe what the other people think. Then you get together and discuss, well, how can we, in theory, resolve this issue empirically? What is the experimental design? What is the, the experiment, the study, the data gathering procedure that will resolve this controversy? You agree on the methods. And what is important, you have to agree that the results of running this study has the ability to change your mind. Third step is that essentially you outsource data collection. So the experiment itself is done by a third party, not by the two opposing parties, but by a third party that can just implement the experiment. And then lastly, you publish, you agree, you commit in advance to publishing the results no matter what they are. And that's really important. So even if the data disagrees with your previous opinion, with your hypothesis, or with your interpretation of the hypothesis, you agree to publish the data. And then normally you should write up the report jointly, but it's also possible just to have one joint report. And then, if you still have opposing views, then you can articulate them in the report. But that's the basic idea. Here's some examples. Some already completed adversarial collaborations. This is about frequency representation. So here the idea is, the basic observation of the fact is that very many experimental subjects are not very good at calculating with probabilities in experiments. But there are various interpretations for that. One interpretation is, well, people are just not very smart and they can't calculate with probabilities. There's an alternative interpretation, namely that essentially the framing is a bad one. If you translate probabilities into natural frequencies, So instead of saying, let's say 2%, you say 2 out of 100, or 20 out of 1,000, or something like that. So you translate every probability into a number, of, of a whole number, such as 1,000 or 100,000 or whatever. Then people will be much better able to calculate those probabilities. And there was a adversarial collaboration about that to settle that issue. Loss aversion is essentially the idea that 100, well, let's say 1,000 Taiwanese dollars that I lose hurt me much more than an additional 1,000 Taiwanese dollars that I get give me benefit. So that there is a certain asymmetry between losing money and gaining money. Ideological conflict and prejudice. This has to do with essentially having prejudices about people who have different political opinions. Again, there's an article about that. And here are some ongoing projects. Is reasoning socially motivated? For example, I'm a professor at an Austrian university. So does my reasoning, also my political reasoning, other kinds of reasoning, are they affected by what group I'm a member of? So that's this question. Is there political bias in the psychology literature? So again, the allegations are quite stark. That a lot of people run experiments and then they don't like the results for political reasons, and they suppress them. They don't publish them just because they don't like them. This is hypothesis. Or is political conservatism associated with cognitive rigidity? So again, this is related to this one actually, ideological conflict and prejudice. And essentially, the idea is if you're conservative, are you cognitively rigid? About that. Do behavioral scientists, psychologists systematically self-censor their empirical beliefs? So what you don't like, you don't believe. And is that a phenomenon that is common in psychology? The promises of adversarial collaboration. Again, it is just one new method that is that is supposed to help with various crises. The main idea is if you compare it to open science really improves the situation post-data once the experiment is run. For example, because there's a requirement to register your experiment before you run it. Why is that? Well, that helps with publication bias. You have to publish because it has been registered. You announce, so to speak, that you're going to run an experiment, and then you have to publish the data, whether your data are significant or not. And so that helps with publication bias that suppresses not significant results, right? But this is post-data. That helps you in post-data. Or transparency. You have to share your data. But again, this is an issue this is a post-data, helps at the post-data stage. AdCall, the advantage of AdCall is that it constrains your degrees or researchers' degrees of freedom, also pre-data collection. So with open science, the problem is you can still design the experiment in such a way that you can still register, you can still publish everything, you can still share your data, but you design the experiment in such a way that it supports your beliefs. This is something you cannot do in the AdCall, and that's the main difference. Constraints in degrees of freedom in articulating the research question, because you have an adversary you have to agree with. You have to formulate a single research question. Choice of methods and design of experiment study, again, you have to agree on an experimental design. Data analysis is done by a third party. You cannot manipulate it. You cannot just say this is an outlier because you don't like that number, right? Things like that. Writing up of findings, again, you have to collaborate with somebody who disagrees with you and agree on the text. So again, it constrains your findings. And it's also said that this practice promotes genuine academic freedom because there are certain taboo topics. If an environment is politically charged, there will be certain topics. Research is a bit taboo. You don't like research on this topic. And this is meant to be reduced by adversarial collaboration, essentially because adversaries come together. That means people with different political beliefs come together to resolve a question. Increase accountability among scholars, again, because there's always somebody watching over you, essentially. And then incentivize scholars to forward claims they have the most confidence in, rather than exaggerating their claims, putting forward sensational claims, no matter what the data say. Or anyway, reading into your data something that is not really supported by the data, which happens a lot. And because adversarial collaborations are costly, take a long time, this should lead to fewer publications, but better ones. And of course, that's very nice as well, given how much is being published, right? It should be nice. Anyway, these are the promises. Now, I want to compare this practice with another attempt to solve issues in particular of personal idiosyncrasies and value judgments. So Karl Popper, Helen Longino, and some others they disagree with the ideals of objectivity that I started out with. Essentially, they are saying, well, look, every researcher is a human, and therefore he or she just has personal idiosyncrasies. Of course, I have a political view. Of course, I do things one way or another. Of course, I have a research agenda. Of course, I have a reputation that, that there are certain, I have a reputation that is associated with certain kinds of beliefs, and therefore I have a stake in certain kinds of beliefs. Everybody has that. So they think that because science is a human practice, we cannot really weed out personal idiosyncrasies, we cannot weed out value judgments, and faithfulness to the fact is something we can't observe anyway. Therefore, they defend a different ideal of objectivity, and that is more something like institutional or procedural objectivity. So they think that as long as there is, every researcher is idiosyncratic. Every researcher has political beliefs. Every researcher has a personal agenda. But as long as there's competition and open discussion of ideas, open criticism of ideas, we have something like procedural objectivity. So they locate the objectivity in the institution of science. And so Popper, for example, believes that ideological bias isn't a problem as long as there is opportunity for others to criticize, challenge, promote their own views, and so on and so forth. So there's a quotation from Popper. It is a mistake to assume that the objectivity of a science depends on the objectivity of the scientist. And it is a mistake to believe that the attitude of the natural scientist is more objective than that of the social scientist. The objectivity of science is not a matter of the individual scientists, but rather the social result of their mutual criticisms, of the friendly hostile division of labor among scientists, of their cooperation, and also of their competition. Now, the proponents of adversarial collaboration point out that we essentially have what Popper and Longino and others promote, but it has failed. So what happens is that, yes, there is criticism, but criticism doesn't lead to progress, it just leads to more publications. So one person publishes something, another criticizes it, and then the criticism gets critiqued. And these debates are never resolved. You stay within your bubble, you criticize others, but you never change your opinion. So that really is the problem. This process is slow. Many publications, very few changes of belief. The incentive structure leads to positions that are exaggerated. Well, because there are just incentives to put out very strong claims, And against sclerotic, that means they're not responsive to criticism. You know, criticism is great because you get citations, but that doesn't mean that you change your opinion. And then essentially, the system favors the emergence of ideological bubbles, right? I mean, like you only really talk in a way that changes your mind within your ideological bubble. You might criticize other people outside of the bubble, other people might criticize you, but your views are insulated from genuine criticism. And so adversarial collaboration is designed explicitly as an alternative to the Popper-Longian. Yeah, anyway. Okay, then I mentioned, I think the practice is really interesting, in part because it gives philosophers of science a role. And that is really the role of a moderator in an adversarial collaboration. And I believe that because one reason is that we philosophers of science do not, as a matter of principle, have a stake in a scientific controversy. So for example, this means, I mentioned the example of loss aversion, and loss aversion can be more technically described as there is a difference between the willingness to purchase, so the amount of money I'm willing to spend on an item, and the willingness to accept the amount of money I'm happy to accept in order to sell the item. So WTP, willingness to purchase, is different from the willingness to accept, the amount of money that I want for it. So an example is coffee mugs. So I get a coffee mug from a certain university. I'm willing to pay. So the amount of money that I'm willing to spend on it is, let's say, 300 Taiwanese dollars. But if I'm given that mug and somebody's offering me money for it, I want 400 or 500, something like that. There's this difference. This is called loss aversion. And there are different explanations for that, different psychological explanations for that. Now, who of you has a view on what the right explanation is? No one, right? And that's sort of the point, right? So we, as not being scientists ourselves, do not have a stake in the matter. So that's why we should be credible moderators. And anyway, because we do not work in the same field, so we do not compete directly, and so we should be credible. But also, philosophers of science have one particular kind of expertise, namely methodological. And I think that has a number of advantages, that very often you can have something like an industry blindness. I mean, that just because in your field you use a certain experimental strategy, as a philosopher of science, you take a more bird-eye perspective on issues, and you know that many different methods from many different contexts, many different sciences, and so on, and you might find a different methodology a scientist might not have thought of. A different way of approaching the scientific question. And so I think that can be very helpful. So I mentioned this, right? So as a philosopher of science, social science, behavioral science, whatever, we have a bird's eye perspective. And so you can suggest an experimental strategy that is not commonly used in the scientific field, that hosts the controversy. There are some limitations. Well, you need really good technical proficiency in order to do that. And I also think that the participation might be less effective in order to address ideological bias, because philosophers of science might also have their own ideologies, and if they subscribe to the same views, then that doesn't help. And there should be a slight reorganization, because I think the moderator should not only run the experiment, but actually be involved also in the design of the experiment phase, because I think, again, philosophers of science really have expertise here. But the main point is, I think this is a great opportunity for us, philosophers of science, to collaborate with scientists. Now I'm going to discuss the limitations. Number one is there is no one who offers adversarial collaboration as a cure-all. So in a sense, my title was a straw man itself, right? So nobody says that it will solve all the problems. It's just one more arrow in the quiver, right? It's one more attempt to solve important problems. I do think it has great promise, and I really love it. I'm all for it. However, I think it has important limitations, and just for not to talk too long, I want to focus on one here, on one limitation in particular. The funny thing is that, as I mentioned in the beginning, adversarial collaboration was designed or intended to solve also ideological bias or political bias. And I think this is something that it's not very good at. And essentially the reason is that I think that in order to accept to enter an ad call, you have to share a lot of background beliefs with your adversaries. Yes, you disagree about a specific hypothesis, but you have to agree on a lot more fundamental background assumptions. If you don't do that, either you won't collaborate, or the collaboration will not be effective, will not lead to any good outcome. I do believe that, especially in the social sciences, ideological differences often are associated with differences in fundamental background assumptions. And therefore that in these contexts, adversarial collaboration cannot help very much. And so in some cases, if it's a specific empirical hypothesis, it can work really well. But in other cases where disagreements are more fundamental, it can't really work. And so the problem is that in the social sciences, very often ideological political differences are associated with differences in worldviews. And a worldview is a constellation. I mean, it's essentially a Kuhnian paradigm, but I prefer for just not to associate it too much with Kuhn, but I use the term worldview. But what I mean by a worldview is a constellation of beliefs that scientists use to explain the world and to navigate in the world. Think of Aristotelian science or Newtonian science as a worldview. So it comprises the following types of belief: fundamental metaphysical beliefs. What is causality, for example? One case study I've been working on is the nature of money. Very hotly debated in economics, and that is not something that we can test empirically. It's not metaphysical in a deep sense. It's a conceptual belief, but that is associated with all sorts of other kinds of beliefs. So that's what I mean. But causality plays an important role in the case study I'm going to talk about. Theoretical scientific beliefs as well. Some beliefs more empirical, beliefs I call beliefs interpreted as facts, but very often a lot of theoretical baggage goes into your interpretation of the facts. So, but anyway, sort of factual beliefs, but then also methodological beliefs. What are the right testing strategies? And lastly, value judgments. And the point is that, and I'm going to give you a case study in a minute from economics, but the point is that very often your scientific beliefs are interconnected with all sorts of other beliefs: factual, metaphysical, methodological, political, value type. And because that is so, it is not easy to take out the scientific claim and test it independently against others. You can do that, but only if you agree on all the other background stuff. And so that's essentially, and it's a Kuhnian story. It's very much a Kuhnian story, but it's a Kuhnian story that is just relevant to what we can expect from adversarial collaboration. I'm going to talk about my case now. So it's an example from the history of economics. And you don't really, if you don't have an interest in economics, just don't listen for the next 10 minutes. I love that case, and I think it illustrates really well what's going on. But you can find, a case in other sciences as well. I just want to illustrate it, and then I know at least one person here is interested. Two. Yeah, great. All three. Yeah. Anyway, see. Anyway, so the case study is the Cambridge Capital controversy, and just to explain, I mean, this was a controversy, and I like to, when I take case studies, I'm not a historian of economics, but I tend to look at cases that are, 20, 30, 40, 50 years old, because then, with hindsight, you can just say more about it. If it's an ongoing controversy in economics, because it's unresolved, it's much harder to interpret because you don't know where this is going. In case of the capital controversy, which happened in the 1950s and 60s, you know where it's going. Actually, it went nowhere, but this is just a fact, and so it's an interesting thing. Superficially, this was a debate. So why Cambridge? Because two Cambridges were involved: Cambridge in the UK and Cambridge in Massachusetts in the United States. And essentially, the researchers were, let's call them post-Keynesian or neo-Keynesian. But post-Keynesian is better, in Cambridge, UK, and then neoclassical researchers in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in the United States. Superficially, this was a debate about the nature and measurement of capital, a very technical question. There's only going to be one formula. I'm going to put one formula on the slide in a minute. But so it was superficially a technical debate. However, because capital is such a fundamental concept in economics, almost everything we believe about the economy, or that is just true about the economy, is in one way or another related to capital. Money, of course, interest rates, growth, development, distribution, justice, injustice, the distribution of income, poverty, all the interest rates. Did I say that already?
Yes.
So anyway, right, like every economic phenomenon is in one way or another connected to capital, and this is why this was so fundamental and so important. Anyway, that is the background. Here are some of the proponents. This is Joan Robinson. So this is the Cambridge UK side, Joan Robinson. This Luigi Passinetti, he is called, and this is Nicholas Caldor, and this is the neoclassical side. So this is Paul Samuelson, James Tobin, and Frank Harm. These are just some of the adversaries.
Was it Frank Harm in Cambridge, UK?
I'm sorry?
Was it Frank Harm in Cambridge, UK?
No. I mean, maybe at some point, but he's definitely on that side of that debate. I mean, he's definitely neoclassical.
I thought he's in Cambridge, UK. Probably later.
Yeah, maybe at some point. I don't remember. I don't remember exactly, but like ideologically, he was on that side of the debate. I mean, that's really what matters. But so here's the technical issue: is the neoclassical production function? So output Q is a simple function of labor and capital input. So it's it's a simple function, and then it has a really nice shape. So the diminishing returns. You put in more capital, you have more output, but the more you do that, the additional output goes down. That's just the idea. So the question is that a useful approximation to what's going on in the economy? Paul Samuelson summarized the neoclassical ideas as three key parables. I mean, that's just essentially the scientific hypothesis that the Cambridge, Massachusetts side agrees on. So the rate of interest rates, is essentially determined by the marginal productivity of capital, right? The price, so the interest rate is the price of capital, right? I mean, like in order to buy capital, you borrow at an interest rate, so that's just the price of capital. But how's the price determined? In the neoclassical fashion, by marginal productivity. And so the idea is, like, how much is this amount of capital? Well, the right value of that is you take that, you add it to production, and you see how much more output it produces. That's exactly the price. So that's just the idea. Rate of interest is determined by the technical properties of a diminishing marginal productivity of capital, right? So that's the, I think I'm not sure if it comes later. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. You can't, this is one. So that's what I wanted to say. The greater the quantity of capital, I mean, that's just what diminishing marginal returns mean. The more capital there is in the economy, the lower the interest rate. Right? So again, right, you add more capital, you have more output at a diminishing rate. That means very highly developed countries where there's a lot of capital already have a low interest rate. That's just what this means. And then the distribution of income between, the main factors, labor and capital, the Marxist thing, right? So there are workers and then there are capitalists. And it's always been, since the times of classical, since Adam Smith, it's been the biggest ideological question in political economy. How is the relative income of these two groups determined? Well, it's just by marginal productivities. So if capital is relatively rare, interest rates are high, so a large proportion of all income goes to capital. If labor is relatively scarce, more income goes to labor. So that's the case. So distribution is determined by relative factor scarcities. The main problem, there are a number of problems. So this is a scalar here in this function. K, capital, is a scalar. So essentially, all capital is commensurable. It has the same unit. And the Cambridge, UK people said that's not the case. Horses, I don't know, I produce, I'm a farmer and I produce corn or whatever. I use horses as capital in order to increase my productivity. Horses are different from machines, from computers, from whatever, from buildings, from other kinds of things. So what they pointed out is that, well, look, different capital goods cannot easily be made commensurable because they're heterogeneous. They're different kinds of thing. They do not have one marginal productivity. If I add a horse, let's say, I don't know, I have to, I'm not fast enough in my head, so I have to calculate in euros or in dollars. So if I add a horse that costs, let's say, $5,000 US, then I change output in a different way from adding, let's say, a new plow or a machine or something else, right? The different types of capital are not commensurable. That's the idea. But the main problem is, well, look, any attempt to make them commensurable, to give them a dollar amount. So the horse, maybe I have to pay $5,000 in order to buy the new horse. But the question is, how much is it worth? And it's worth as much as it adds to my output. But the problem is, in order to make that calculation, I need an interest rate. Why is that? Well, because it's a capital good, so it endures over time. So really what this horse is worth, not just what it produces this year, but also next year and the year after and the year after. But then if, say, it produces an additional $500 next year, and then 400 the year after, and then 600 the year after that, and then 700 the year after that, and so on and so forth, I need to make these income streams, I need to add them up. But how do I add them up? Well, I have to use the interest rate to discount them. And therefore, that formula actually is circular. You can't both explain the interest rates by looking at the amount of capital, but then if you want to give a value to what capital there is in the economy, you need the interest rate. So that's the fundamental problem the Cambridge UK side pointed out. Capital things aren't easily commensurable. Any attempt to make them commensurable needs the interest rate, but then you can't explain interest rates by means of stock of capital, amount of capital. That's the main point. But this circularity causes in turn what is called Wixel effects, and that is just any effect, on sort of the production function that this interrelation has, that this circularity has. But in particular, it leads to certain weird phenomena called re-switching and capital reversing. But essentially the idea is that at very low interest rates, a certain production technology might be optimal. Then at medium interest rates, you switch to different production technology. But then at very high interest rates, you switch back, so re-switching, right? You switch back to the first. So that is a phenomenon that is possible, and that was excluded by the neoclassicals. But anyway, it leads to all sorts of anomalies. That interaction between how is the interest rate determined and how is the value of capital determined. Now what happened? So this is just a picture of Cambridge, Massachusetts. The neoclassical side accepted re-switching, capital reversing, Wixel effects in general, just as possible empirical phenomena, but they didn't think that it challenges their fundamental views. They just, we need to adjust some technical details, but we do not have to change our fundamental beliefs. But the neo-Keynesians, or neo is not good, post-Keynesians, they thought that these phenomena had shown that the entire framework, the neoclassical framework, is misguided, in particular the subjective theory of value. I don't want to talk too much about that, but essentially they said, well, look, the entire framework is wrong, you need a different kind of framework. But the main thing, what happened is that this controversy was never resolved. It somehow just fizzled out, mainly by the Cambridge UK people dying. And it was, but it's not that the neoclassical side somehow, they made a few adjustments, but then other things happened, and this was never properly taken into account. It just died out. And communication was so difficult between these two sides. And I just want to, here's just a quote from a paper by James Tobin, beginning of a paper. I have long since abandoned the illusion that participants in this debate actually communicate with one another. So I omit the standard polemical introduction and get down to business at once. But he is just observing what's going on. We can't talk to each other because our beliefs are so fundamentally different. And so then the last thing I'm going to say here is that I just emphasizing how the worldviews of these two sides differed. And, it's not just, okay, here's an empirical question, what is capital? Or what's the best measurement strategy for capital? But it's actually associated with lots of other beliefs, and here are some of them. At the theoretical level, the neoclassicals, so the state side, believe in the subjective theory of value, and essentially their theory begins with the consumer. What is anything in the economy worth? Well, that's determined by the consumer, and essentially by the additional utility the final unit of the good gives me, so it's marginalism. But don't worry about that first. The post-Keynesians, they rejected this theory of value, and their worldview was more structured around a production-first thinking about the economy. It was production relations. I mean, it's much closer to Marxism, right? But like, it's production relations that determine. I mean, that sort of the Schumpeter talks about a vision, a non-scientific vision with which every scientific investigation starts. The neoclassical vision is the consumer and subjective value. The neo-Keynesian or post-Keynesian vision is production relations. That's really important. Causality, well, causality is monodirectional in the neoclassical version, so it goes from capital to the interest rate. Here, there's mutual causation. That, in turn, makes methodology difficult. So on the one hand, the neoclassical side really likes equilibria, and then you essentially determine a causal effect by calculating equilibria under different conditions. That's called comparative statics. They didn't like this at all. They think, well, sometimes there may be equilibria, but what is more important is time and processes, adjustments, just developments over time, and not something that happens at one moment in time. That's entirely uninteresting. They did not, so this side thinks that, well, look, of course, our production function is an idealization, is a simplification, but it's a very useful simplification. Cambridge, UK, simplifications are mirages. They don't tell us anything about the reality. And also, if causationism goes in one direction, you can use standard regression as a method for testing hypotheses. You can't use that if there's mutual causation. It's just not applicable. And then in measurement, all capital goods are in principle commeasurable. They emphasize heterogeneity. History, well, that's also interesting. The neoclassicals thought that there's a continuous line between classical economics, so the economics of Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and other people, and what they do. The post-Keynesians thought, no, you're doing something completely different. It's really bad what you're doing. So that's a different understanding of history as well. And this is really interesting because both sides, this is not a controversy about liberal versus conservative or however you want to express it, about right and left. These are both left-wing economists. But the neoclassicals are something like, you might call the neoclassical liberalism. So essentially the idea is that they accept the fundamental market order, but also emphasize that it has problems, and there's an important role for the government to intervene. Within a fundamentally capitalist order, there has to be regulation, there has to be redistribution, and so on and so forth. There are lots of market imperfections which have to be corrected. However, all of that within a fundamental capitalist order. These are much more fierce critics of free markets. They don't like free markets at all, right? So within left-wing ideology, it is different branches, let's say, different schools. But that's what makes it interesting. But because it's not left versus right, because they fundamentally believe in the same thing. They're in the American term, they're both liberals, right? I mean, they're both progressive. Just different branches of progressivism. Anyway, this is associated with all these other fundamental beliefs, and therefore there was no communication possible. And I think that the interesting controversies in social science tend to be a lot more like this. Then we agree on everything else, and then there's this tiny scientific thing that we disagree with. And this is sort of an important limitation for adversarial collaboration. So the Cambridge adversaries subscribe to different worldviews, and so there's no way they could even agree to the first step. namely describing properly what the other side thinks. It's going to be impossible. So anyway, here's the summary. I love AdCall. I'm all for it. It's a really promising new method, but yeah, anyway, it really has the potential to resolve some scientific disagreements. Exciting opportunity for us, for philosophers of science, but there are important limitations, and I think it can work really well when the disagreement is about a low-level empirical hypothesis and a lot of background assumptions are shared. Very often, in the social and behavioral sciences, real controversies are more about worldviews, and it just can't, work there. And sort of in Kuhnian terms, just to use Kuhn again, its AdCall is a practice for normal science, for making normal science better. If you're working within a paradigm, or as I prefer to say, worldview, working within a worldview, you can resolve disagreements, but you cannot resolve disagreements between worldviews or between paradigms. So that's the point. And anyway, and then just to end with, so I think all we can hope for in the sciences that are like that is something like a conditional objectivity. So that like things can work well if you accept certain kinds of beliefs, but fundamentally there will always be disagreements. I do not think that controversies like the capital controversy or controversies about which theory of value is the correct one, or controversies about which theory of money is the correct one, will ever be resolved. And therefore, for those things to play a good role in society, you just have to accept background assumptions. Then everything else can be determined in this procedural objective way, but not if you disagree with fundamental assumptions. Anyway, that's my bottom line. Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to take a 10-minute break right now, and we will start Q&A at 4:47. Just text me and I'll know it.
你要跟他一样，是不是？啊，去那边可以赚到那个加拿大公民。这我跟宇轩讲的，赚到加拿大公民，赚到加拿大的公民，就时间到就有了。
他们蛮松的。
就去了。
还有好几年的人，
家很希望。
现在没用。上台有一个有一个台湾的，对，我知道，但我只是也，对，其实很多台湾的，那个不错，有教育。
有没有奖学金？对，再等一下。
我听说会有点长。
我等下帮忙问一下问题。你要帮忙问一下问题。
我有小的一些，
对，大学长，大学长，他2020有啊，他2001毕业啊。
哦，这点2020，
对啊，他早我1年毕业。2001。
Okay, it's about time. So we have in-person participants and online participants. So we can accept questions from anybody. Does anybody want to get us started? Yeah, Kohan.
So just go for it.
Yeah, go for
Okay,
it.
so yeah, well, I love this project, but I have a worry. So, well, given my background in so I work on social choice theory and relevant areas. One thing that I'm wondering is that whether this process, or no, I should put it this way. So, how similar is this process to deliberation in, say, a deliberative democracy? Because I mean, when people do deliberate, when people deliberate, they also share their ideas, and there are rules to follow, and somehow reach an agreement. And if this is comparable, the next question is, do problems of deliberation occurs here as well? So there are empirical studies showing that, well, if there are two groups of people who have like very different views, and you present them with the same body of evidence, somehow they'll get even more polarized. I'm wondering if the same thing will happen in this scenario. So this is the first question. The second question I have in mind is about the limit of this method. So you say that, well, they somehow need to share their worldview, but I think there are probably issues and problems that need to be solved by the collaboration of, say, by collaboration of different group of social scientists, say like sociologists and economists. Could this method be applied between them as well? Yeah, I'm wondering about the limitation of this.
Yeah, thank you. It's a really, your first question is super interesting. I know that literature a little bit, but I would never have sort of tried to apply it because, it's not, science. That's the old saying, right? Like science doesn't proceed by voting or by anything like that. But by argument and by appeal to the evidence and to the facts, and then Well, you have to acknowledge that it's not so easy to appeal to the facts, and you agree that social processes play a role, and this is a method to try to manage, the social nature of that process. So I think, I think in a sense, it's a little bit, because again, like in the deliberation case, but anyway, the one thing is a one. So there's always data. There's always an additional empirical input. It's not just deliberation. And then there are a number of points where the deliberators are forced to come to some sort of conclusion, or they just have to give up, right? But they have to agree on a method, and then they have to publish it somehow. And I guess that's sort of different, but it's also different with respect to there's this additional empirical input that is the outcome of a previous agreement that comes about by deliberation. So yeah, I think that there are. It's anyway. I'm sorry. I'm just thinking through because what did I want to say? Sorry, I lost my train of thoughts. I'm sorry, I lost my train of thoughts. But yeah, anyway, I think there are some disanalogies here, but it would. This was on a previous occasion of giving this talk, and I think that's really important for deliberation. And like you have difference between sort of voting essentially and deliberation is, people with a strong reputation. What leaders essentially, they can have an overly, and of course there's an idealization here that those kinds of things don't matter, and that is a problem. So I do think actually, and thank you for the suggestion, I think that we can learn something from the deliberation literature about how to organize this really well. So I essentially agree. And we have to worry about things such as groupthink within an adversarial collaboration. That is certainly true. And I shouldn't have a stronger influence on what methodology gets chosen just because I'm, whatever, the more, I have a higher H index or something like that, right? And there are important considerations for how to organize the adversarial collaboration. So thanks very much for that input. That's really interesting. And sorry, the second
question is about the limitation of this method. So here,
economists and sociologists. Yeah, that is interesting. I think, however, that very often, even if you come from different scientific disciplines, you can share lots of background assumptions, politically, methodologically. Now, political scientists really are very much like new classical economists in many ways, sort of methodologically and so on. And so I think that can work very well. But then there are other cases, quantitative, qualitative approaches within the social sciences, independently of that might be really hard, to collaborate. I agree. And
I have a small question about the case study. So the Cambridge controversy, I really like the case, but is it the best way to describe the method of ethical? Because the result is they disagree on the very first assumption, or the very first step. But so after this examination, using this method, we know that they don't agree on a very fundamental basis. But does it say that? So I don't know. If there is a case, say that because you emphasize on the philosopher's role, right? So, but as a philosopher, maybe if you can find another, I don't know, like a controversy that they disagree on the second or third stage, and this is where the philosophers can intervene. Like saying like, okay, after my analysis using echo, and we can identify what's going wrong during this controversy. So in that sense, I'm not sure whether the Cambridge controversy would be the most representative case when using this method to examine the disagreement between scientists.
So, yeah, thank you. I mean, in a sense, I use that case in order to describe two ends of a spectrum. There's one end of the spectrum where things are likely to work really well. And that is when, well, essentially we share everything anyway, but then we disagree on, some sort of low level. And I think in the actual ad calls, this is what's happening a lot. And then you go to the other end of the spectrum where you live in different worlds. Reality is often it's like will be in between. I'm just making a prediction that ad call is more likely to work the closer it is to this end than the farther away it is to this end. I mean, this is why I'm using a case that is in some sense extreme, and I agree with that. However, I wanted to say, well, look, controversy in social science has different forms, and it's more likely to work for some forms than for other forms, and that's the point. However, to some extent, so this issue about frequency representations, I mentioned Daniel Kahneman. So he is the main proponent, and there was Tversky as well, but Tversky has died already. So he's now the main proponent of the so-called heuristics and biases literature, which is extremely influential in politics and in science. And so essentially that takes neoclassical rationality as an ideal and then shows how actual people deviate from that ideal, and as a next step to make policy recommendations on the basis of these deviations. So, and frequency representation, or anyway, the problem that allegedly people cannot calculate with probabilities is just one example of this broader literature. Now, the other side, the most prominent proponent is Gerd Gigerenzer. And to some extent, we can say that he has a different worldview. He definitely, his policies are not a lot more classical liberal. So he's less strongly advocates government interventions and rather wants to give people tools to improve their reasoning, make the individual stronger rather than have a government that's intervening on your behalf, right? So to some extent, there are proponents of different paradigms. But what happens in an adversarial collaboration then is that they can agree on one tiny technical question. This was not about frequency representations versus probability representations. This was about a particular experimental technique which had to do with sort of intra-group and intergroup comparisons, and sort of the validity of using intergroup differences as indicative of what people believe, about this stuff. So it was a tiny little almost methodological issue that they could agree on, and they agreed on the result of that without that changing anything with respect to their more fundamental beliefs, which also have a political dimension, let's say. And so that's kind of what I want to say. Well, look, it does work if if your disagreement is like on this very specific scientific or methodological hypothesis, And then let's say in this case you didn't care about the rest, but it doesn't move forward the fundamental debate. It did not change either side's minds about, what is better, frequency representations, or is it really a mistake in the reasoning? It did not change that at all. It changed this tiny little bit. And this is kind of what I want to illustrate with that, what it can do. It can do something if you already agree on a lot, or if sort of the disagreement is something very empirical that we can both agree on, but I will not change my fundamental beliefs. That's the point.
Okay, so our next question is an online question from, Joan, and I think she may have typed her question in the chat. If you're in the room, I can add you to the queue if you raise your hand.
So do you want to read it? Or?
No, do you want to ask the question yourself?
Hello, hi. Thank you very much for the talk. Well, actually, I put my questions because I said I wanted to save the speaker from troubles looking at a small screen. So, if Karen, would you, because I don't know if there are delays or something or any like signal or internet problems. So, if Karen, would you mind, or can I just, or should I just read my question?
Yeah, you can just read your question.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. Well, I didn't expect that. A little bit shy though. So once again, thank you very much for the exciting talk. That strikes me as showing some possibilities of the philosophy of science getting involved in maybe some kind of reconciling activities between scientific disagreements. So my question is quite simple, little, and I don't know if I missed something. So my question is merely about our participation in this sort of reconciling activity or this sort of collaboration. So I would like to know how exactly can we get involved in this sort of collaboration, apart from being passively invited by the scientific community. I don't know if that was clear.
Yeah, thank you. So the benefits are at this point theoretical. I don't know of an actual adversarial collaboration philosophers have contributed to. So one would have to see, but what I envisage is that, when the two opponents get together, there's a third person or whatever, if there's more, whatever, there's an additional person who reads up on the controversy and tries to bring in his or her expertise to resolve that controversy. And this can be in the proposal of an entirely new experimental strategy, I was thinking. So because we are not scientists, but we study science, we tend to study more of the history of science than the average scientist, or more different sciences than the average scientist. And so there is a possibility that one is aware of methodological experimental strategies that the two scientists, who have their own specific backgrounds, will not know about. And then one brings that to the table and says, well, look, I think in this particular case, here is an entirely new experiment that we could do that neither of you thought of. And that's just an example, like that just by having a different background, one might suggest, with respect to interpretations, because we're more aware. Many economists are not aware that, when they say well-being is the satisfaction of preferences, that this is a value judgment. And so you can add things like that. You just, because of your background, you see things in a certain way, you've thought about particular kinds of things that I think sometimes can help resolving these disagreements, because a disagreement might actually be about value judgments rather than of scientific nature. And you could identify that, and scientists might not, be able to do that in this particular case. But anything specific, I mean, it just depends on the case, and we'll have to see it. It's never happened. And anyway, but I'm working on, collaborating with scientists on exactly these issues. So, I will report it back once it's happened. Thanks for the question.
Okay, so Ying, you're next.
I think my question is also quite related, and I really like this project, but it seems to me the ethical design is negotiating between different values from two existing parties and the two existing assumptions or theories. And when you look, it seems to me that when you look into the practice of data collections, it's not possible to make the data collection the neutral one. If you have some assumption or you have some theories, you try to prove it or try to negotiate into this. So it seems to me it's not possible to make. Yes, my question will be how can we make the data collection a neutral one, as you have mentioned in your slide.
I'm not too sure if I understand it. So, I mean, the idea is, it's always the third party that is not meant to have a stake in the debate, that is actually running the experiment. And so, because it's the third part, I mean, that according to their proposal, but my proposal is in that respect is the same. So, because the data collector does not have a stake in the debate, they have less, so there's always something that goes wrong in an experiment. Question is always, what do you do in that case? And your preconceived, your substantive belief might affect what you do if something goes wrong. You repeat the entire experiment, how do you treat outliers, how do you, what do you do in that case? And that will be affected by what you want the experiment to show. But that doesn't happen if the data collector is a neutral person. That is sort of the idea. I mean, it's not that this person does not have their own personal idiosyncrasies, political views, and so on, but they do not have a stake in that particular debate, and therefore they have less reason. And this can, I'm not saying everything is fraudulent, right? You have to make choices. Things go wrong, you have to make choices. Which choices you make will be affected by the result you want to achieve. But that won't happen if you don't have a stake in the matter. That's sort of
Song Yue.
Yes, thank you very much for the talk. I guess I have two questions. The first one is related to the kind of epistemological footing of ethical. So the way you describe how it's done, particularly involving third parties for data collection and data analysis, seems to be quite a positivist one. So being able to separate data from researchers and then outsourcing analysis to yet another researchers or a third party to conduct that seems to suggest that all these different parties are separated and therefore ensuring their objectivity. But for people in a more kind of radical philosophies or radical societies, they would argue that researchers and their knowledge and the data they produce are all very intimately connected, and therefore objectivity should be understood and practiced in other ways. So is that kind of positivist understanding of scientific procedures and knowledge actions meant by ethical, or this is kind of my misunderstanding? So that's the first question. The second question is that what's the need for philosophers engaged in ethical? Because I mean, scientists get to publish articles and papers and so on, and then Because I'm very detached. Philosophers engaged in ethics will be very detached from the actual knowledge production processes, and therefore they can't be named as co-authors and so on. So, why do you do this?
I mean, let's take the second question first. Look, I mean, there might be different. The jobs I've been working in for the, I don't know, last 15 years or so have incentivized very strongly with what is called impact. So, like in order for, I mean, especially in the UK and the United States, but increasingly also in continental Europe, we as professors get evaluated partly as a function of engagement outside of our own discipline. So in my previous department in Durham, every few years, we had to present so-called impact case studies. And, that in my case, one thing I did was, I had a collaboration with the Ministry of Defense because they were interested in making evidence-based decisions about essentially buying weapons. And because I work on evidence, we could talk to each other, and then I could present my work as impacting how the UK Ministry of Defence makes its buying weapons decisions. So, and that, they like that very much, right? My university. But then, so anyway, that's just an institutional fact about, my previous job. So, this is an opportunity for us to do this kind of work that might have a practical input, at least an input, or impact, outside of my own discipline, philosophy of science. But then, of course, I think I can learn from that. I learn science better. I learn about these controversies. My philosophy of science might improve because I have a closer engagement with the thing I talk about, I think about all day. And so I really do think that intellectually I can profit very much. So, and then, my employer doesn't care so much if I, as long as I also publish in philosophy, I can publish one or the other properly scientific paper. I don't think they wouldn't mind. And actually, as a philosopher of science, I think that it would be good for my, whatever, for my reputation or whatever. So I think there are lots of benefits for us. But you're right. Some of these benefits are relative to certain institutional incentives, and not everybody have these institutional incentives. With respect to the first question, I think I'm much closer to what you call the radical or philosophical approach than you think. And I do think that, I agree, that I think that the original proposal was more positivist, very optimistic about the issue of outsourcing and having these neutral data collectors and so on. And I gave a more, I think, detailed story about what the obstacles to what you call the positivist approach are. And that you need to agree on a lot of other things in order to be able to do this. If you agree, it's fine. If you don't agree, you are tightly connected to data collection. And so I think I'm very close to you, or to the side you call radical and philosophical, except I try to present a somewhat more detailed explanation for why that is so. And essentially say, well, look, the positivist approach is possible sometimes, but under fairly tight conditions.
Thank you.
Okay, Karen?
I just have a very small questions about how you identify the type of controversy that's fit with this type of method. One thing I thought about is that a lot of times scientists they only publish it that's their successful data. They don't publish what's go around and they try but it didn't work. It's not on the publications. I was wondering, I just come up, suddenly I thought about this possibility that we as like a third party, and then we thought, oh, this is famous during my work, but they maybe have tried before, it just they didn't publish on the paper. So and I guess you probably already have strategies to deal with this kind of situation, but I just want to hear like what would be your strategy to avoid this kind of situation.
But like it's part of the protocol that you can't. I mean, you will, like then of course you will have to find a home, but you commit to publishing no matter what comes out of it. So that, that's like pre-registration. But then of course, in practice, a lot of the, like in medicine, it just doesn't work. Pre-registration, they're all pre-registered, and then they're conducted, wrong result, it doesn't get published. So it still happens, right? And I see that there are these practical problems. To some extent, this is an ideal, and then one has to see that there are. I certainly do. Anyway, previous strategies such as pre-registration have shown not to work so well, and there are these problems here as well. I totally agree. Sure. But ideally, everything gets published, but it has to happen in practice as well. Sure.
So I think I'll insert myself into the queue at this point. I think this is really cool, and I'd like to see it happen more, but I also see like a potential obstacle. And it's related to what you said about this kind of this kind of methodology resulting in fewer but higher quality publications. And so I think this comment has to do with the fewer part of that. You began by talking about like the replicability crisis, and I think there's some consensus that one of the driving factors that's causing this crisis is like the publish or perish culture. And so there is this pressure, and as long as there is this kind of pressure, I think people, especially like early career researchers, are maybe going to want to avoid adversarial collaboration if it in fact results in fewer publications. And so it seems like in order to implement this kind of methodology, there would have to be, even bigger structural changes within science to make that happen. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about this.
What I left out, so I did change, the talk for this audience, talking more about objectivity, but for that reason, I also talked about other stuff less. And one slide makes the most. It's not exactly the same point, but a related point. So I think we can't all do ad call all the time, quite obviously, because then we run out of adversaries, right? So, and then what I say is there has to be some sort of division of labor. And one of the possible ways is that younger researchers create the controversies in the beginning of their career, because they still have to make a reputation, and they have to get a chair or whatever, and they have to get a job, and so they have to publish a lot and make strong claims and make a name for themselves, all of that. But then once you're established and more settled, and then you can start doing the ad calls, and that would address that problem as well. I think. Once you have your professorship. Yes, there's some pressure, but you won't lose your job, right? It's not. And then you can slow down a little bit and focus more on quality than just mostly on quantity. So I think that is, but I entirely agree that there are some, it's like, it's great, but we can't have too much of it. But the other thing, and thank you also for that, it emphasizes that it's really not a cure-all. You need different strategies, and open science is really also important, but other institutional reforms are important as well. And I agree that the general incentive structure is just very bad. Anyway, I think on one slide I might have I've mentioned peer review, reforming peer review as well. But anyway, that's just, I mean, there are different ways where you have to attack, and the point emphasizes that. I agree. Thanks.
Yeah, Chris?
Yeah, thanks. I thought the talk was really interesting. I learned a lot actually. So I work mainly on philosophy of mind, so this is a bit of a naive question. But I was just wondering about this, the statement that you have here. And I guess there's maybe a couple of ways. So one of the question might be thought of as, can you say more? So you said there's this kind of spectrum where, alcohol might work in these cases, which are kind of low-level empirical disagreements, but it's not going to work when there's kind of value or theoretical disputes or something. But I was wondering, you might think that kind of science in its normal guise just will handle these low-level empirical. That's the kind of job of science. So I was wondering, how deep is the rottenness? And you give all these kind of, problems with science, but it seems like, if it's not as bad as that, then this should kind of deal with it anyway. And then there's no position for alcohol. Or how far, where does alcohol come into it then? Because you would expect, we can solve an empirical disagreement.
So yeah, thank you. It's a really good point. I think like what my view is that there are so science doesn't in general, science doesn't work as the logical positivists had it, right? There's some like this mind, and then the mind confronts its hypotheses with the observations and updates its beliefs in response. There's a lot more, we're humans, and there's a lot more going on. And I think some of these human contributions to science, necessary human contributions to science, can be resolved. And it really does have to do with, look, people make their name. I mean, one example is power posing of a phenomenon. So the idea is, I don't know, if I stand more like this, then I gain confidence, but I forgot, like there are all sorts of benefits, standing like that, power posing is called. And apparently the science of that is really poor. But those people who promote it have made a career out of that. So now they have a stake and they do not change their minds. So lots of people think that this really helps, but then there are these critics. And I think that is a good example where it's sort of the social pressures of publishing, the social pressures of having to make a career. At some point, the perception of you being associated with a certain kind of hypothesis. Those are the kinds of things that can be addressed. But once it's more sort of fundamental, theoretical, metaphysical, ideological disagreement, that won't be resolved. So that's sort of the idea. I hope that answers a little bit.
Any other questions? Yeah, Ingtong?
So, one small question. So if there's a debate, and between both sides of the debate, there are like within one camp, there are different understanding of, for example, how what kind of experiments will be able to decide this debate. Then how do you for this kind of how do you choose who will be representing each side? Because it's more like consciousness studies or this kind of study, and I've heard people complaining that they're from maybe one side, but they don't entirely buy into what their own sides agree on. And so just interested do you have any idea on this, or have you observed how this?
I mean, very often it's really those names are associated. I mean, Kahneman has done some. These are, in the best ad calls that have existed, or that have been conducted already. You have really proponents that are associated with very strongly with certain hypotheses, certain schools, one could say. Again, Kahneman is one example. Ralph Herdwig is another example who's closely collaborated with Gigerins at that side. So, but that's of course an ideal case, and they can't do all of them, right? And then if you go sort of to the next tier of researchers, I think, it would be great to have Corey Clark here now to talk about their experiences with the big project that they have. So they got funding to organize these things, and we have a proposal to talk together and present some of the results of that project, and I hope that I can't because I don't know about that, about the more practical experiences with trying to get researchers together, so I don't really know, but this is part of the project
You need a charger.
It's okay. I think we'll start.
Just has
Okay.
to be reconnected.
Yeah, we do have time for probably one more question at this point. So I think, did Yan Zhang have one more question she wanted to ask?
Yeah. May I?
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, okay.
It's
Uh,
just
Are you ready?
my computer says low battery, so it's going to turn off soon. I don't know, this doesn't seem to be working so well.
Yeah, take your time. Thank you.
I don't know, but
It's not actually charging.
Yeah, so that's the problem. And it was at some point, but it stopped. Well, we have 7%, so we have.
It's okay, this one's still
Yeah.
on. You will turn.
Okay.
Just use the next one.
Okay,
Just your computer.
shoot.
Yan Zhang, you can ask your question now.
Okay, thank you. Hello, hi, it's me again. This second question is, so I don't know how relevant it is to the talk directly, but I'm quite curious. So I would like to know how you would quickly comment on the relationship between this sort of disagreements on scientific progress, because it strikes me, correct me if I'm wrong, if I misunderstood. Because it seems to me that you were suggesting that scientific progress is hindered by that sort of disagreement. So we want to reduce that. So we might, if we have some ways to reduce that sort of disagreements, and then we can contribute, we can improve scientific progress. So I don't know how you would say about this, the impacts of disagreements on scientific progress. And that's it.
No, but that's exactly. I could have phrased the entire talk in terms of scientific progress. Exactly. That's so. But that's also it's been in the debate with Kuhn and then after Kuhn and commenting on the work. There's the big question: is there scientific progress at all? If you just if there's incommensurability between paradigms, and then it's just not clear that the new paradigm is in any sort of substantive way better than an old paradigm. You can define progress by solving more empirical puzzles within a paradigm, but then between paradigms, it's just very hard to say. And this is kind of the point I was making here. Progress is going to be, ADCOL is meant to help with scientific progress, but it's limited in the context where it can fruitfully be applied. That's the idea. So yes, it helps, but it only helps within a worldview and not between worldviews. And maybe this is something. I'm very, very skeptical about genuine progress in social science. I really have to. I'm not sure if we know more about the economy than Adam Smith knew. I'm really not sure. I really wouldn't want to bet my life that we know more about the economy than Adam Smith did. So,
Okay, well,
I mean, certainly there are many senses in which we know more, but there are fundamental senses in which I don't think we know more. So.
I guess that's the note that we're gonna end on. Maybe we will not ask Julian like about his collaboration with David, whether it's adversarial or not.
In this case, no. However, there is, and I won't mention his name, but there is quite a prominent philosopher of science who's really doesn't like the stuff I say about values, and I want to invite him to do an adversarial collaboration about the role of value judgments in science, actually. So I want to use that method as well in philosophy. I mean, like, it's difficult because, you know, you don't really have scientific data, you don't have new data, but I think you can also collaborate with really people you fundamentally disagree with, and just force yourself to, you know, to see whether there are, for instance, distinguishing things. Maybe we have a broad agreement, and then these are more specific points that you can learn, and you can advance progress. You know, you can have philosophical progress by collaborating with philosophical adversaries.
Sounds great. Well, please join me in thanking Julian once again for a great talk.
Can we take some group photos?
I don't see why not. Unless, are we pressed for time with?
No.
Okay.
Julian can just move here. I can take it.
So should we just stay where we are, or were you thinking that we will line up somewhere?
Why should I?
Here, just here.
here.
Just here. I guess.
In front?
I don't know. Just follow Karen's order.
Yeah, Karen said you could just sit up there.
Yeah, sit up there.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
来，拍照。
Can we all fit in?
把酒拿走。
你的镜头会被投影到吗？
不会。
I think Shanka did not want the bottle of Gallion in the
No.
picture. Maybe you could put it on the floor.
这一吗？
It's not in?
Yeah, no, I think it's.
Yeah, it looks pretty clearly in.
Okay, 1, 2, 3, yeah! I take the last, okay. Do you want to switch to another pose? Like, yeah, no.
Yeah, this is what we do in Taiwan. We always have to take a photo like that, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, 1, 2, 3. Okay, it's done. Yeah.
Usually there's a whole series of that. Like you do that, and then you do this.
And do this, yeah.